I think so much of peace photography is actually enabling communities to represent their lives in a much more holistic way that, yes, incorporates part of their lives in relation to conflict, but also represents the very kind of resilient, colourful and joyful parts of community life that survive and can even thrive in the context of conflict.
Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast about peace and conflict in the media. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. We use the name Making Peace Visible metaphorically. You're listening to me right now without visuals. But what does peace actually look like? Images of peace processes usually follow a particular format anywhere in the world. The core activity in peace building is dialogue. So whether it's men in suits or women in colorful ethnic dress, what we see is a group of people in a room talking. Meanwhile, we're inundated with dramatic images of war and violence. With war happening in so many places at once, it's difficult for anyone to see peace as a possibility. But what if we expand the concept of peace to include what peace means to people who've lived through conflict? Then, what peace actually looks like can be more expansive. Our guests this episode are Tiffany Fairey and Ingrid Guyon. They're both photographers and educators who've worked around the world helping communities affected by conflict to tell their own stories through photography. Earlier this year, they published a guide to the practice of peace photography, which is available for free online in English, Spanish, and French. Peace Photography, a guide, presents a methodology and approach that celebrates peace efforts and encourages creativity, drawing on projects in 21 countries. Tiffany Fairey and Ingrid Guyon, welcome to Making Peace Visible.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
So there's a photograph in the introduction of the guide that stood out to me. It's a group of 10 women in colorful Central American dress. Most of them have these deep red skirts on, and they're posed in two lines with 4 women squatting in front and 6 standing behind them. And it's your typical group photo, but instead of looking at the camera, each woman is holding a camera up to her eye as if they were taking a picture of the person who took the photo. Who are these women, and why do you choose this photo as part of the introduction to the guide? What is the image telling us?
Well, that's a great place to start, Jamil. So that image is actually from a project called Voices and Images. And that group of women are from the Association of Mayan Ixil women. So they're an indigenous women's group from Guatemala. And these women worked with an American academic called Britain Likes. They were a group of survivors who were looking to support their community to rebuild after the Guatemalan conflict. And working in conjunction with Britain Likes, these women used PhotoVoice, which is a participatory photography methodology. They used the camera to help them reflect on, identify, and discuss the problems that were affecting their community as they sought to rebuild after the kind of very violent conflict that had affected their communities over the previous, decades, really. So as an opener to the Peace Photography Guide, really this image sums up the very kind of focus of the guide, which is on how communities who are directly affected by conflict, how they use photography as a tool to rebuild, to transform ongoing conflict and to resist ongoing violence. Peace Photography, a guide, is interested in this concept of what a photography of peace might be, but we're specifically looking at it not in terms of professional image production, but we're interested in how communities themselves use photography through participatory and collaborative photographic projects. Often they're working in conjunction with local facilitators, local photographers, academic researchers, but how these groups really are generating their own images to try and transform the ongoing conflict, but also rebuild community after the devastation of conflict and, of course, during.
Using their own cameras in a sense, to photograph their own lives is a unique way of telling their stories. What kind of impact does it have on them?
So these women were involved in an iterative process where they used photography to investigate the issues that were facing Indigenous women who had survived the conflict and were looking, to rebuild their lives. So they tackled issues around women who had suffered particular atrocities or forms of violence, who were looking to try and regain employment. They looked at issues like addiction in the community, rebuilding economies after the devastation of the war, rebuilding homes, being able to support their children, education. So they used the camera really as a way to investigate all these key issues that were so vital to the rebuilding of their lives.
Ingrid, I want to ask you, this is a big question, but what is peace photography? How do you define it for the purposes of the guide?
Well, that's a very interesting question. For me, peace photography regarding the guide is how can communities show and explore what peace is to the outside world and inside their own communities, and how they can use photography to dialogue and to heal, to make peace visible, to make their identities and communities visible, to change narratives. And because peace is very unique to each person who's experiencing it, so how can you actually show it to the outside world? So I think peace photography allows each individual as well as each community to show peace, how they live it and how it has evolved or how it is still evolving. And I would say that it's really about that it's a process. It's really a collective process more than just a picture-taking activity.
I'll pose this question to either Ingrid or Tiffany, but who is peace photography for? You're smiling, Ingrid. Is that a complicated question?
I mean, I think first of all, it's for the people who are actually creating the images themselves in the first place. It depends because when communities do peace photography, then they decide what the audience should be. So some communities would allow for the images to be seen into the outside world. And then in that case, any general audience is a peace photography consumer, let's say. Newspapers, definitely, I think, a must.
I mean, my clear immediate reaction to that is it has to be for everyone. A lot of photography, when they become kind of genres or tradition, it kind of becomes a bit exclusive. You go to any photojournalism festival and the war photographers, it's very masculine. It's very kind of flat jackety. There's a certain kind of, aura around that kind of thing. And so I think there's an element with peace photography. It's really about trying to provoke visual practitioners into how we can do the photography of conflict and peace differently. Because by putting the frame around peace rather than conflict, it's really trying to push practitioners out of the usual ways of doing things. Because I think there is an element where war photography, I mean, a lot of war photography is anti-war photography, but it uses the same old narratives and perspectives and I would say methods as well. And this is why we're trying to expand the methodological base of what might be included as peace photography. But really, I see photography as being for everyone.
Ingrid, tell us about your own professional background and your journey into this, working on this topic.
Well, basically, photography is in my blood because I was born where Nicéphore Niepce took the first picture of the world, well, apparently, in history. And I first wanted to be a photojournalist and a travel photographer and an anthropologist until I studied anthropology and visual anthropology. And then I kind of didn't like it at all. I would always remember this teacher telling us whatever you read in those anthropological books are lies because the chief of the tribe don't share the true stories. They just give it to you so you can write your piece and leave. And from that on, I never read any of those books. And I wanted to hear the voices of the people themselves and started to do some research and discovered participatory photography and discovered the PhotoVoice organization that Tiffany had created and chased them up for a few years until I managed to do an internship there. And then I never moved on from doing participatory photography. And I started to do a photography project on the Colombian diaspora women. And at that stage, actually, a very good friend of mine, I would always remember she used to introduce me to her friend and said, "This is Ingrid. She's a peace photographer." That was like 10 years ago. And I kind of never really, thought about it until,
You didn't know, not everybody knows that's a thing.
Yeah, I didn't know it was a thing. Because I've always worked doing all participatory methods, all focusing on the ethics of narratives and collaboratively and focusing more on positive stories rather than victimizing. I've always been against that. And dialogue has always been part of my practice. So I've been doing peace photography for longer than what I thought.
Well, Tiffany, let me ask you the same question. Give me a sense of your journey into this topic.
Another early lover of photography. I wanted to be in the art room at school and I was hopeless at drawing, but they had a darkroom. So I love photography. I went and tried to be a photographer and had a similar, I don't know if I'm not the right character for it, but I think there was always something that made me feel in a similar way to as Ingrid is describing, that taking photos of someone was like putting words into their mouths. So I ended up doing a participatory photography project, working in Nepal, working with a group of young people who were living as refugees. This is about 25 years ago. And on the back of that, worked with a friend, colleague called Anna Blackman, and we founded a photographic charity, an NGO called PhotoVoice. So essentially, we were specializing in community and participatory photography projects, and we worked all over the world over quite a long period. Really, I guess my kind of drive and interest and fascination was seeing how communities or people chose to use the camera to tell their own stories and really facilitating that process. After running PhotoVoice for more than a decade, I really wanted to take a step back to be able to do research into this process of participatory photography and think about its impacts and ethics. So I ended up doing a PhD around this subject and went and learned from a lot of other projects, different participatory and community photography projects working around the world. And since then, really, I've been based at the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. I received a research fellowship that has really allowed me this kind of huge privilege of being able to look around the world and see who and how people have been using participatory visual methods in post-conflict and conflict situations to support and foster peace. So I've got this kind of practitioner, academic, like foot in each camp, which can be confusing at times, but also really rich.
There's no question that the news media thrives on the drama of war and violence. In a conventional sense, the drama in peace is what's not happening. Bombs are not exploding, people are not dying. But in peace photography, there's a different kind of drama. Can you talk about the drama in peace photography?
Well, in peace scholarship, there's a lot of thinking around this idea of everyday peace. And some of the debate and some of the writing around peace photography is like, peace is banal, peace is mundane, and how do we make that visually compelling? I think peace photography is really trying to push the boundaries of what is visually significant or what's visually relevant, because it isn't really about necessarily the search for iconic images. It's really about helping us refocus and reappreciate the things that do keep a community together and that build resilience, help healing. A really great project that we could point people towards is this Everyday Peace Indicators project, where communities in Colombia have photographed their signs and kind of indicators of peace. And much of those images are just concentrating on day-to-day life. So it might be images that show the luxury of clean water, being able to go to the market and sell your produce, being able to visit your sister after 10 p.m. at night without fear of violence. Peace is so multidimensional that in that sense, just showing this kind of day-to-day life that people who are not living with conflict or not living with ongoing violence might take for granted, but just that ability to be able to kind of live, earn a living, live safely, put food on the table. That is definitely the subject of quite a lot of the projects.
Sure.
I think that when you mentioned the word drama in peace photography, there's two projects that came to mind. Odyssey projects in the US. There were pictures taken by war veterans, and they are really beautifully created images. Some of them, the story behind it and the process of creating the captions are like really moving and quite dramatic stories. But the fact that they were able to all create it together and talk about it because, they came back from war and they're rebuilding their lives, transformed the drama in something much more constructive and positive. And it was the same in Cogiendo Vidas with the Colombian victims of the conflict, where they were also the fact that they could share quite dramatic stories all together in a room without fighting against each other, without thinking about which political sides they were on, and without judging who was more a victim than the others, was quite healing in a way. So they were all sharing dramatic stories. but transforming them into something positive to move forward towards the future.
To give people a different model, in a sense, a different, like you said, an aspiration.
And we saw this in the project, the Everyday Peace Indicators project in Colombia, going back to this, what is peace photography and who's it for? What we saw in Colombia was that actually a lot of the community photographers wanted to use the opportunity of creating images and having an exhibition to celebrate some of the older members of the community that had stayed at times when a lot of other members of the communities either forcibly or were displaced, but those kind of campesinos and older members who refused to move, and in doing so they kind of resisted the conflict and sought to maintain these communities and preserve these communities. In a way, these older members of communities were now being held up as examples for how to rebuild, but also how peaceful cultures can survive because they maintain certain traditions, they held certain values.
I mean, I share your fascination with Colombia's peace process. It's so well documented. It's had tremendous ups and downs throughout the process.
Yeah, I did a lot of work with the diaspora in Europe. And what I found about the Everyday Peace Indicators project is that it's actually very useful from my experience for the Colombian people themselves, because at some point during the peace process, because it's very fragile and there's still a lot of violence and human rights abuses in Colombia, even though the peace process going on, many Colombians didn't believe in the peace process because they thought that you sign a peace agreement and then the whole country changes from one day to the other, but that's actually not true. And I think this project, Everyday Peace Indicators, reminds that peace process takes decades and that it's very important to value every single step that is taken. For example, there is this picture of two children under a bed. It's a black and white image. And the caption is, "We are hiding under the bed because we're playing hide and seek, and we're not hiding because of the bullets anymore." And those little stories, I think, really shows that peace is happening, drop by drop in communities. And that's the message for me.
Let me take the conversation in a slightly different direction. Peace photography has a lot of parallels with peace journalism, a practice we've spoken a lot about on this podcast before. Peace journalism is meant to foster an environment conducive to peace, and peace journalists refrain from demeaning or divisive language. In conflicts, they tend to prioritize images that show the so-called human side of conflict, and some of the practices involve refraining from using words and images that might get more attention because they're provocative. Ingrid, when you facilitate peace photography projects, do you instruct participants to work within certain parameters? How do you go about it?
Well, it depends because each project is different and each community is different. But it depends also what the aim of the project is. For example, for the Tejiendo Vida project, I worked with a psychotherapist from Colombia who could really support the participants, because what we wanted was for them to start sharing their stories of what happened to them, but in a very safe space, and then to transform it into the future so they could leave that behind and use the resilience of what they've been through to become stronger rather than focusing on the sad stories and on the trauma. So we used their personal archives. They used new pictures that they took, and everybody was kind of free to share whatever they wanted. The only guidance, I would say, was that we all had to listen at each other and not judge anyone and support each other and feedback on each other's stories. And there's no really judging on what the image looks like or the quality of the image. That's always like a no-go.
There's so many different kinds of projects, but one thing that is kind of fundamental, I think, to peace photography is that it recognizes the potential for harm as well as for growth, because the peace in peace photography is not a given. Photography can foment conflict. It can, drum up hate. It can embed stereotypes and all sorts of, persistent conflict narratives. It can do just as much to facilitate and foster those things as it can to facilitate peace.
Absolutely. And it does on an everyday basis.
Exactly. And so the first point of calling, I think, for peace photography is to be very cognizant of that, being aware that isn't predictable and that, you can share or talk about an image and different people are going to react to it in different ways. And that's the great richness of photography, because it allows for all these differences and plural perspectives to emerge, and it allows us to explore difference, but it also that has the potential for harm. So being kind of very attuned to what trauma might look like in a different conflict settings, what could be visual triggers, what could be triggering. All these kind of ethics are really crucial. There's a lot around security and protection. Obviously, people being identifiable through images. I mean, there's a mound of stuff that there isn't time to go into detail about, but that's really at the core of what we talk about in the Peace Photography Guide, this kind of quite intentional approach that's very cognizant of harm and conflict as well as peace.
And I guess something that is also common is like to not impose any theme or any question, or really force the participants to go into a direction that they don't want to, kind of has to come from them.
Well, I mean, a lot of photography in conflict zones or refugee camps, even if it doesn't portray violence, seems to skirt the line between human dignity on one hand and a sense of victimhood on the other. As a photographer, how do you stay on the right side of that line, Ingrid?
Yeah, I don't know. That's not really an easy answer. The question about dignity is quite an interesting one, because I did try once. I was facilitating a project in Senegal, and the images were supposed to be used. So they were created by the community, and they were supposed to be used for a fundraising campaign. So they wanted, rather than send a photographer to take pictures, they wanted the community to portray themselves and share their images. And I really insisted and share them images of, the typical NGO images that victimize people and that don't really have dignity, so they could decide by themselves how they wanted, if they wanted to be portrayed with dignity or if they wanted to show a bit of being more vulnerable. And they chose both because that's how the community was. I was hoping that it would only show the really dignified images, but for them it was very important to show that there are also things going on, and that if they don't show it, then people are going to think that this community is just all happily perfect.
Right,
but
right.
It's complicated.
But you've written about the first time you visited Belfast in 2018. Can you talk about what shocked and surprised you on your first trip to Northern Ireland?
Well, I couldn't understand the concept of the peace walls at all, because they still separate communities. I don't know, I just couldn't believe that community was still living like that and that no one knew about it. And still a lot of people don't know about it. And I remember that, I don't know if it was just coincidence or not, but as I was taking pictures of the peace walls, the person in charge of closing the gate was there and kind of gave me the key to close the gate. And I don't know, it just made me feel really sad and awkward and angry at the same time that the communities would not be able to live without those walls. Because also from what I was told, I mean, that was a few years ago, that the community themselves wanted to keep the walls.
Well, you've both worked with Belfast Exposed, which is a photography organization that was founded in 1983. So it's been around for a long time. Can you share a little bit about the origin story of Belfast Exposed?
Belfast Exposed is an amazing organization. It was founded during the years of the Troubles by local Belfast photographers who were kind of fed up with how their communities were being represented visually in the media. And I think they started off holding a photography competition, or not really competition, but anyone could enter. It was an exhibition. Anyone could enter pictures of the community. And I think it was really about trying to represent the community in terms of the joy and the relationships. And yes, the conflict, yes, the troubles, but also tell a much fuller story of the community and what was important to the community, the spirit of the community, all these things.
A more three-dimensional story, you mean?
Exactly. Just as Ingrid was talking about in relation to the Senegalese community, I think so much of peace photography is actually enabling communities to represent their lives in a much more holistic way that, yes, incorporates part of their lives as in relation to conflict, but also represents the very kind of resilient, colorful and joyful parts of community life that survive and can even thrive in the context of conflict. So yeah, Belfast Exposed was very much formulated as a grassroots project trying to push back against media portrayals of communities. And what's been incredible really is how it's evolved over the years. Now it's kind of known as Belfast's kind of premier photography institution, and it's got this incredible reputation. International photographers exhibit there. But this core community character of its work is still integral to the organization. And all through these years, the organization has carried on using photography within the community to support community issues, the peace building process in Northern Ireland. And that has taken lots of different forms: social justice programs, vocational training for young people in photography. They've got dark rooms. They do a lot of projects around the peace walls, in fact. And one of the images in the guide is, again, I think, one of the most compelling peace images for me anyway, because it looks so boring and ordinary. It's just a picture of a kind of a street scene, essentially, of a Belfast street, a residential street. But actually, what's happening in the image is that two groups of young people who are living either side of a peace wall, so from a Protestant Catholic communities, have come together to create this image. And what they've actually done, it's a photoshopped image where they have digitally removed the peace wall to reveal the view that doesn't exist, but that might exist if the peace wall wasn't there. So with their photography, they're kind of almost digitally playing with what peace could look like, might look like. Because, you know, as Ingrid said, many of the communities don't actually want the walls to come down. They feel much safer with them there. And while for visitors coming from outside of Northern Ireland, they find it absolutely extraordinary, the idea of 50-foot walls in the middle of a city separating communities. But actually to the communities who live there, they're completely normal. They've been there all their lives. They're just the stuff of everyday life. But what happens with an image-making process where these young people have come together to create a shared image of this landscape that doesn't exist, of what it might look like if the wall wasn't there.
An imaginary landscape, yeah.
Yeah, and they've kind of digitally removed the wall with Photoshop. So they're kind of playing with the idea of the walls coming down. And actually what many people talk about in relation to Northern Ireland is one of the biggest barriers to peace are the mental barriers in people's head. So what's happening there is photography is being used to slowly break down those barriers bit by bit.
Yeah, well, you did a very good job of answering a question I didn't even have a chance to ask yet. I was going to say, how has the role of Belfast Exposed changed in the 27 years since the peace agreement?
Well, the one thing I didn't mention was their focus very much now is using therapeutic photography. There are huge challenges within Northern Ireland with mental health, conflict-related trauma, intergenerational trauma. This is very much borne out in the statistics, and there's a chronic underfunding as well of mental health services. And so they've really focused on that now and doing all sorts of incredible initiatives where they're really using photography to support mental well-being with people who, yes, they might be getting treatment in mental health institutions, but also within the community. And a lot of that therapeutic photography is about working through trauma, but it's also about just bringing people together, breaking down isolation, rebuilding communities, friendships, but also enabling people to get out of the house. Specialists will say, trauma isolates people. And photography really is a means for people to just get out and about, look at the world differently, go exploring, go walking. So it's really multifaceted in that sense, how photography is supporting this kind of post-traumatic growth. But again, inherent in that is this very careful use of photography with an awareness of how doing these processes could also trigger or embed harm as well. So it's, again, these very careful, intentional methods.
I think one very interesting thing also that Belfast Exposed is doing is that because they have those 30 or 40 years of archive of the conflict and they have, I don't know, millions of black and white negatives, they're making them available and using them in their workshops to do collage where people can reuse the archive and explore the archive and the conflict from a new perspective and mixed with another art form. And I find that quite interesting because it's a way to kind of talk about the conflict and explore it, but without really doing it directly. And also making the new generation discover something that they probably have not been aware of.
Right, because they were too young.
Because they haven't lived it, yeah.
I want to ask a question about process. The process of participatory photography, how this work actually happens on the ground today. I mean, smartphones are common in many parts of the world. Many have pretty decent cameras, but they can come with a lot of distractions. When setting up a community photography project, how do you decide whether to rely on cell phones or provide cameras?
Again, it's the same answers. It depends of the project, it depends of the context, it depends of the budget, it depends of the security. I think I'm going to share an example to see if that puts that into perspective. Lately, I've done a project with young migrants in Spain. And initially, we brought some small digital cameras because we wanted the young people to really focus on taking pictures and be away from their phones. And that worked very well. But the downside of that is that they could only take pictures during the workshop because we couldn't, for security reasons, leave them the cameras outside of the workshop space. So I think a lot of stories are not told in that sense. But then in a group, we didn't have much time with them. So we had to use their mobile phones and they used their personal archives to share their stories. So it was a completely different process, but the result was the same. Maybe was a bit more therapeutic than the others. The ones that used their mobile phones, they shared very personal stories, while the others, I think it was more collective stories. So yeah, and it depends. But one thing that is important is about printing the images. That I think that's something that Tiffany and I really pushing. It doesn't matter what kind of camera you use. If you print the images during the workshop, it really makes a huge difference on the dynamic and the dialogues and how you can intervene in them and order them and cluster them and tear them apart.
What is the relationship between peace photography and social media? It's all digital. And social media can be a very inflammatory space.
I think a key aspect of peace photography is definitely this question of visibility. And I think in the projects that we're seeing that are using social media, it's often about trying to carve spaces online that get people talking and thinking about what peace might look like, or coming together to kind of create a shared vision through plural visions, if that makes sense. One of the projects that we profile on the website, there people were submitting images to try and create a shared landscape. This is in Cyprus, where again, obviously we've got kind of divided communities. So there it's about using social media as a way to generate a kind of shared vision of something by everyone submitting pictures and them all being seen and used together. But actually, in a number of projects, we've used Instagram where it's not necessarily about sharing the images publicly, but using social media as a way that individuals in the projects or groups within the projects can share with other groups. So they create closed groups. They do kind of photo diaries back and forth, so I'm thinking particularly in Bosnia, a group of young people who came together to do some photography workshops, and they then went back to their different towns and cities all over the country, where they're back into the kind of mono-ethnic communities. And there they were swapping pictures over Instagram as a way to stay in touch and kind of create a visual dialogue when they're not directly in the same place.
And I guess what the most important with the social media is to make sure that the communities understand that the images will be shared and that they agree and that they understand the impact that it could have, because once it's shared online, you can't really do anything about it.
It has a life of its own. Almost.
Yeah.
Can I just add quickly about the sharing or not sharing? Because a lot of peace photography projects do not share their images, and it's really important. That is kind of one of these crucial decisions. Like a community might not want to share their images, or they might go through a whole process of creating images and then realize that they shouldn't share them. It goes back to this nuance of who they share it with and why and how. And then a lot of those projects, let's say the therapeutic photography ones in Belfast Exposed, no one shares their images with anyone. They might just do them for them personally to share with their therapist or maybe the other people in their group, but no one beyond.
Yeah, and I think the role of the facilitator or the photographer in charge of the project with the group has a key role in that, because it has happened to me sometimes that the community wanted to share it within the local communities, but then after discussing it, kind of made them realize something that they hadn't realized of something that could happen to them. So then they changed their mind. So I think it's an ongoing conversation. And also because we as photographers or facilitators, especially if we are from, the Western world, we are, I think, more exposed to social media and newspapers, and sometimes communities that we work with, they're not. So they're maybe not fully aware of what could happen.
Tiffany, your new book, Imaging Peace, How People Use Photography to Resist Violence, Transform Conflict, and Build Connection, will be out this fall. And it's going to be a multi-country study of participatory peace photography, a topic that's not, as we've discussed, not much in scholarship about. Based on the evidence, how would you describe the value of these projects? Like if you were making a case to a funder for supporting peace photography, how would you present the research?
In terms of the kind of funder's pitch, I think it would go back to really trying to understand what a funder wants to achieve, because what is so compelling about photography as a tool is its flexibility. Photography can be used to support healing, as we've talked about in therapeutic photography projects. It can be used to support dialogue, to navigate difference, to rebuild relations in communities where there might be entrenched division. But it can also be used to support communities that might be marginalized by peace processes to kind of re-enter the conversation or become visible within national dialogues or international dialogues. It can be used, as it actually is done in that Colombia project, where, local communities' views on peace aren't necessarily part of the national or international conversation, or aren't used as a way to create indicators for peace building effectiveness. So there, in the Everyday Peace Indicator project, it's very much being used to help evaluate what success looks like in terms of peace building. So there are these very diverse applications, and photography can be used to support or facilitate all of them. But ultimately, photography is only a tool. There are opportunities, but there are also limitations. And it's not a given that photography is going to support peace. And it's really about those kind of processes that are going on around the image making and the people who are doing that and taking ownership of it. They're in the end the ones that are going to be really making peace happen and making that peace visible. So while I'm a huge advocate of what peace photography is and what it can do, ultimately it's the people using the peace photography that make the peace happen.
This has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate, and I'm so glad that you guys have written the guide, which is a great contribution to the field, a contribution that people didn't really know was needed until you invented it.
Well, huge thanks to you, Jamil. I think that's a wonderful way of putting it, a contribution that people didn't know they needed. I think that sounds brilliant. And I encourage all people to go and download the guide. It's free and there for whoever wants it, and in 3 languages. But thanks so much for the conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and let's see if this podcast helps, because I think it's been downloaded in 72 countries, the guide. And we would really like to reach all countries. So.
Right. Well, our podcast has been downloaded into 124 countries. I don't know.
Great. So let's see if we can reach that.
You can learn more about Tiffany and Ingrid's work and download Peace Photography, a guide, at imagingpeace.org. We didn't have time to get into this in the interview, but the guide features 26 photography exercises that you can try in your own community or classroom. They're also on Instagram at Imaging Peace. If you want to try doing peace photography, or maybe you're already a peace photographer, we'd love to see your work. You can find us on Instagram at Making Peace Visible, or email us at info@makingpeacevisible.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't keep it a secret. Take a screenshot of your podcast player and text it to a friend, or leave us a rating or comment wherever you listen. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.